Margaret Thompson's weathered hands froze on the steering wheel, her pickup truck lurching to a halt on the desolate Wyoming road. The coffee thermos tumbled from the dashboard, spilling across faded family photos scattered on the passenger seat. There, trapped in the dried mud pit ahead, wasn't the rusted machinery she'd expected to find at the abandoned ranch. It was a dying German shepherd, barely breathing, its dark eyes locked onto hers with desperate recognition. The dog's expensive leather collar glinted in the afternoon sun, revealing documents that would change everything she thought she knew about her late husband's secrets. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Leave the dog to die, or you'll join it." Her arthritic fingers trembled as she read the words twice, then dropped the phone onto Harold's memorial card. The shepherd let out a weak whimper that cut through her soul like a knife. She thought of her own loneliness, her empty house, her son Tyler, who hadn't called in 8 months. "Not today," she whispered, grabbing her emergency kit. "Nobody dies alone on my watch." But who was watching her? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie Thompson had never imagined her 72nd year would bring her to this moment, standing alone in the Wyoming desert, staring at a dying dog while creditors circled her family ranch like vultures. 2 years had passed since Harold's funeral, yet she still caught herself setting 2 coffee cups each morning, still talked to his photograph propped beside the kitchen sink. The loneliness had become a living thing, following her through empty rooms that once echoed with laughter. The ranch foreclosure notice crumpled in her jacket pocket served as a constant reminder of her financial reality. $247 remained in her checking account. Harold's medical bills had consumed their retirement savings, and the mortgage company showed no mercy for a widow's grief. Today's drive to meet with the bankruptcy attorney was supposed to be her surrender, a final admission that she couldn't maintain the 100-acre spread that had been in Harold's family for 3 generations. Margaret had spent 45 years as a registered nurse, tending to others' pain while burying her own. Her hands, though weathered and marked by age spots, still remembered how to assess vital signs, how to comfort the dying, how to fight for life when others had given up. Those same hands had held Harold's as cancer stole him away, breath by labored breath. Her son Tyler had inherited his father's stubborn streak, but none of his compassion. At 32, Tyler had built a successful YouTube channel documenting treasure hunts across the American West, drawing millions of subscribers who lived vicariously through his adventures. Yet he couldn't find time for a 10-minute phone call with his grieving mother. Their last conversation had ended in harsh words about practical decisions and facing reality, his euphemisms for selling the ranch and moving into a retirement community. The isolation had grown unbearable. Margaret's nearest neighbor, Jim Mitchell, lived 2 miles away in a trailer surrounded by broken-down vehicles and bitter memories of his own. The 65-year-old retired firefighter struggled with PTSD from his years running into burning buildings while others ran out. Their occasional conversations over the fence line had become her only human contact some weeks. Dr. Rebecca Foster ran the county's only veterinary clinic from a converted barn 12 miles down the mountain highway. At 58, Becky had recently finalized a messy divorce that left her fighting to keep the clinic operational. Rising medication costs and declining ranch populations made rural veterinary practice financially unsustainable, yet she persisted, driven by the same stubborn compassion that had drawn Margaret to nursing decades earlier. This harsh landscape had shaped them all, survivors clinging to purpose in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to their struggles. The endless Wyoming sky stretched overhead, beautiful and merciless, a reminder of how small human problems appeared against the vastness of creation. Yet in this moment, staring at the dying German shepherd, Margaret felt the first stirring of purpose she'd experienced since Harold's death. Sometimes salvation came disguised as responsibility, and sometimes the act of saving another creature saved yourself in return. The German shepherd's labored breathing created small puffs of vapor in the cooling desert air as Margaret approached the mud pit. Each step closer revealed the full horror of the animal's condition. Ribs protruding through matted fur, infected wounds on his hind legs, and eyes that held both pain and an inexplicable flicker of recognition. The dried mud had hardened around his body like concrete, trapping him in a prison of his own desperation to reach water that had long since evaporated. Margaret knelt at the edge of the pit, her nurse's training automatically cataloging symptoms. Severe dehydration, hypothermia setting in despite the afternoon sun, and what appeared to be deliberately inflicted injuries. This wasn't an accident. Someone had left this beautiful creature here to die. The expensive leather collar around his neck seemed grotesquely out of place, adorned with silver studs and a nameplate that read Duke in elegant script. "Easy, boy," she whispered, extending her hand slowly. "I'm here to help." Duke's response shattered her composure. Despite his weakness, the dog lifted his massive head and attempted to crawl toward her voice, whimpering with what sounded remarkably like relief. His dark eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that spoke of intelligence and desperate hope. Margaret had seen that same look in terminal patients who refused to give up, the fierce determination to live that transcended physical limitations. Her fingers found the collar's clasp, and she gasped as a waterproof pouch fell open, revealing legal documents wrapped in plastic. The letterhead belonged to Weatherby Associates, a prestigious Denver law firm, and the name Charles Weatherby jumped from the page like an electric shock. The papers detailed an inheritance worth $2.3 million, with Duke listed as the primary beneficiary under the guardianship of the first person to demonstrate genuine care for his welfare in the event of the owner's death. Margaret's mind reeled. Charles Weatherby, could it be? Her older brother Charlie had disappeared from her life 30 years ago after a bitter family dispute over their parents' estate. He'd changed his name, moved west, and despite her efforts to reconnect, had remained a ghost from her past. The photograph clipped to the documents confirmed her suspicions. An older, more distinguished version of the brother she'd lost to pride and stubbornness. Her phone's shrill ring pierced the desert silence, displaying an unknown Colorado number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Mrs. Thompson." The voice was male, rough with barely controlled anger. "I suggest you step away from that animal and continue on your way." "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what's best for everyone involved. That dog is suffering. The humane thing is to let nature take its course." Margaret's nursing instincts flared into protective fury. The humane thing is to help creatures in need, not leave them to die alone in the desert. "Who are you to—" "I'm Nathan Cross, the dog's legal owner. Those papers you're looking at, forgeries. Charles Weatherby was a senile old man who made promises he had no right to make. Duke belongs to me, and I want him put out of his misery." The line went dead, but not before Margaret caught the sound of an engine in the background. Someone was coming, and instinct told her it wasn't to help with a rescue. Duke struggled against the hardened mud, his efforts growing weaker with each passing minute. Margaret realized with growing horror that the pit wasn't just a trap. It was a grave someone had expected to find, filled by now. The positioning near the abandoned mine, the deliberate distance from any traveled road, the timing of Nathan Cross's threatening call, this was attempted murder, plain and simple. She examined the mud more carefully and discovered traces of motor oil mixed with the dried clay. Someone had deliberately made this substance more adhesive, ensuring that any animal unlucky enough to fall in would be unable to escape. The cruelty of it made her stomach turn, but it also ignited a righteous anger she hadn't felt since Harold's cancer diagnosis. Margaret pulled her emergency medical kit from the truck and began assessing Duke's vital signs with professional efficiency. His pulse was weak but steady, breathing shallow but consistent. The infected wounds needed immediate attention, but hypothermia posed the more immediate threat as evening approached and desert temperatures began their steep decline. "You're going to live," she promised Duke, whose tail managed a single weak wag at her determined tone. "I don't know who did this to you or why, but they picked the wrong day and the wrong victim. I've spent my whole life fighting for things worth saving, and you, my beautiful boy, are definitely worth saving." As she worked to stabilize Duke's condition with the limited supplies available, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that rescuing this dog meant more than saving a single life. Something about Duke's intelligent gaze and the mysterious inheritance suggested that fate had placed them both at this crossroads for reasons neither of them yet understood. The distant rumble of approaching vehicles confirmed her suspicions. This rescue was about to become considerably more complicated. The setting sun painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of amber and crimson as Margaret realized she couldn't extract Duke alone. The hardened mud held him like cement, and her 72-year-old frame lacked the strength for such a demanding rescue. With trembling fingers, she dialed the only number she trusted: Jim Mitchell, her reclusive neighbor whose own demons might understand the urgency of saving something worth preserving. "Jim, it's Maggie. I need your help at the old Riverside mine. There's a dog trapped, and I think someone's coming to make sure he doesn't survive." The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Jim's gravelly voice responded, "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm asking. 20 minutes. Jim Mitchell had spent 37 years running toward fires that sent others fleeing. But retirement had brought different battles, ones fought in the privacy of his trailer with bottles of bourbon, and memories that refused to fade. The last structure fire before his retirement had claimed 3 children despite his best efforts, their faces haunting his dreams with accusations he couldn't answer. When Margaret's call came, something in her tone broke through his self-imposed isolation. He arrived in a cloud of dust, driving a modified pickup equipped with winch systems and excavation tools, the practical arsenal of a man who understood that preparation meant survival. Duke's condition shocked him into professional focus. The German shepherd's breathing had grown more labored, and hypothermia was setting in as desert temperatures dropped with frightening speed. "Jesus, Maggie. How long has he been here?" "Days, maybe longer. Look at this." She handed him the inheritance documents, watching his weathered face transform with recognition. "I know this dog," Jim said quietly. "He's Duke, the therapy animal from the VA hospital in Denver. Helped dozens of veterans work through PTSD episodes. This boy has saved more lives than most people ever will." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Duke wasn't just any abandoned animal. He was a decorated service dog whose work had touched countless lives. The betrayal of leaving such a noble creature to die in the desert seemed even more unconscionable. As Jim positioned his truck for the extraction attempt, headlights appeared on the horizon, moving fast across the desert floor. Margaret's phone buzzed with another threatening text. "Last warning, walk away now." "Company's coming," Jim observed, his hand automatically checking the service pistol he still carried from his firefighting days. "And they're not bringing flowers." Dr. Rebecca Foster arrived just as the distant vehicles became clearly visible, her veterinary clinic's mobile unit equipped with emergency medical supplies that might mean the difference between Duke's survival and death. She'd received an anonymous tip about a trapped German shepherd at the old mine, though she couldn't explain the urgent compulsion that had driven her to respond immediately. "Oh, God," Becky breathed as she saw Duke's condition. "This is deliberate. Someone wanted him to die slowly." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, administering a saline IV drip and pain medication, while Jim worked to soften the mud around Duke's trapped limbs. The dog's eyes tracked their movements with evident gratitude, his tail managing weak thumps against the hardened clay whenever Margaret spoke to him. "I've been looking for this dog for weeks," Becky revealed as she worked. "His owner, Charles Weatherby, died in a suspicious car accident. And there were rumors of foul play, questions about his will, but the investigation went nowhere. Duke disappeared the day after the funeral. The approaching vehicles, 3 SUVs moving in formation, suggested that Duke's disappearance hadn't been random." Margaret felt the familiar surge of righteous anger that had carried her through decades of advocating for vulnerable patients. Someone had orchestrated Charles Weatherby's death and Duke's abandonment with cold calculation, and she'd be damned if she'd let them succeed. Jim's excavation work had freed Duke's front legs when the first SUV skidded to a stop 50 yards away. Nathan Cross emerged from the driver's seat, flanked by 2 men whose expensive suits looked absurdly out of place in the desert setting. His face bore the desperate expression of a man watching his carefully laid plans unravel. "Stop what you're doing!" Nathan shouted, his voice carrying across the desert air. "That animal is my property, and you're interfering with a lawful decision to end his suffering." "The hell we are," Margaret replied, rising to her full height despite the arthritis that made standing painful. "This dog isn't property. He's a living creature being tortured by a coward." Nathan's facade of legal authority cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. Charles Weatherby was a demented old man who made impossible promises. That inheritance is a fantasy, and that dog is dying anyway." Duke's reaction to Nathan's voice confirmed Margaret's suspicions. The German shepherd, despite his weakened condition, attempted to pull himself further from Nathan's direction, whimpering with obvious fear. Whatever relationship they'd shared, it hadn't been built on kindness. "Funny thing about dying animals," Becky called out, not pausing in her medical work. "They usually don't show this much fight unless they believe rescue is possible. Duke's not ready to give up, which means neither are we." Jim positioned himself strategically between the newcomers and the rescue site, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Years of emergency response had taught him to read dangerous situations, and everything about Nathan Cross screamed desperation disguised as authority. "I'm calling the sheriff," Margaret announced, reaching for her phone. "No signal out here," Nathan replied with satisfaction. "We're too far from the main road. Sometimes accidents happen in remote locations, and by the time help arrives, it's too late to save anyone." The threat hung in the cooling air like a toxic cloud. Margaret realized they faced a choice that went beyond rescuing Duke. They were witnessing a crime in progress, and their survival might depend on their next decisions. Duke's eyes never left Margaret's face, as if the dying dog understood that his fate rested with these 3 strangers who'd chosen compassion over convenience. In that moment, looking into the intelligent eyes of a creature who'd spent his life serving others, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. "Jim," she said quietly, "how long to get him free?" 10 more minutes if we're lucky. Then we work, and we don't stop, no matter what." The battle lines were drawn in the Wyoming desert, with a dying therapy dog as the prize and the darkness of human greed as the enemy. Time was running out. But Margaret Thompson had never walked away from a fight worth winning, and she wasn't about to start now. The desert standoff intensified as Jim's winch system finally broke the mud's grip on Duke's hindquarters, but the German shepherd's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Becky worked with desperate efficiency, her veterinary training pushed to its limits as she fought hypothermia and dehydration with limited field equipment. Duke's breathing had become increasingly shallow, his noble head resting heavily against Margaret's supportive hands. "His core temperature is dropping too fast," Becky muttered, wrapping emergency blankets around Duke's trembling frame. "Even if we get him out, He needs immediate intensive care or he won't survive the night. Nathan Cross paced behind his SUVs like a caged predator, his expensive suit jacket abandoned as desert sweat stained his designer shirt. The two men flanking him, introduced tersely as business associates, maintained professional stillness that suggested military or security backgrounds. Their presence transformed what might have been a rescue mission into something far more dangerous. "You're making this unnecessarily complicated," Nathan called out, his voice carrying a note of forced reasonableness. "Charles Weatherby suffered from dementia. That will naming the dog as beneficiary. It's not legally binding. I'm saving you all from a lengthy court battle you can't win." Margaret's nursing instincts recognized Nathan's behavior, the sweating, rapid speech and darting eye movements of someone under extreme stress. Whatever drove his determination to ensure Duke's death went beyond simple greed. This felt personal, desperate, and increasingly unhinged. Jim's radio crackled to life, startling everyone in the tense silence. "Base to Mitchell, do you copy?" The retired firefighter exchanged glances with Margaret before responding. "This is Mitchell." "Jim, it's Sarah at dispatch. We've got reports of vehicle activity at the old Riverside mine." "Everything okay out there?" Nathan's face darkened with fury. Someone had been monitoring radio frequencies, which meant their isolated location wasn't as private as he'd believed. The tactical advantage was shifting, and desperate men made dangerous decisions. "Tell them we're conducting an animal rescue," Margaret whispered urgently. "Dispatch, we're assisting with a trapped animal extraction. No assistance needed at this time," Jim replied, but kept the radio channel open, a subtle signal that help was aware of their location. Duke's tail managed a weak thump against Margaret's leg, as if the brave dog sensed that the tide was turning in their favor. His eyes, though dimmed by pain and exhaustion, held on to that spark of intelligence that marked truly exceptional animals. Margaret had seen similar determination in her most courageous patients, the ones who fought against impossible odds because something inside them refused to surrender. Suddenly, dust clouds appeared on the eastern horizon, moving fast across the desert floor. Nathan's confident expression faltered as the approaching vehicles became clearly visible, not reinforcements for his cause, but a convoy that included what looked suspiciously like law enforcement markings. "Expecting company?" Jim asked with grim satisfaction. Nathan's radio squawked with an urgent transmission. "Sir, we've got multiple vehicles approaching from the main highway. Looks like sheriff's department and possibly federal agents." The game was changing rapidly, but Nathan's desperation seemed to deepen rather than diminish. A cornered animal was always most dangerous, and Margaret sensed they were approaching a critical moment where rational behavior might give way to panic-driven violence. "Time to go," one of Nathan's associates advised, moving toward the lead SUV. "No." Nathan's voice carried the edge of a man watching his last chance slip away. "We finish this now, or we lose everything." Becky had managed to stabilize Duke's vital signs enough for transport, but the dog needed immediate surgical intervention. "I can keep him alive for maybe 2 hours," she reported quietly. "After that, organ failure becomes irreversible." The approaching convoy consisted of 3 vehicles, a sheriff's patrol car, an unmarked federal sedan, and what appeared to be a mobile veterinary unit with Denver animal control markings. As they drew closer, Margaret could see additional passengers, including someone in the back seat of the federal car who looked remarkably familiar. "Tyler?" Margaret breathed, recognizing her son's distinctive silhouette despite the distance and dimming light. Nathan's radio crackled again. "Sir, that's Tyler Johnson in the federal vehicle, the YouTube guy. He's got cameras running." The revelation hit Nathan like a physical blow. Tyler Johnson's YouTube channel boasted over 3 million subscribers who followed his treasure-hunting adventures with rabid devotion. Any footage from this encounter would go viral within hours, exposing Nathan's actions to worldwide scrutiny. "How did he—" Nathan began, then stopped as understanding dawned. "You called him, didn't you, old woman? Somehow you got word to your precious son." Margaret shook her head truthfully. She'd had no contact with Tyler in months and certainly hadn't called him about the rescue. His presence here suggested something far more complex than coincidence. As the convoy reached the mine site, Tyler burst from the federal sedan with characteristic intensity, but his usual camera-ready confidence was replaced by raw emotion. He ran directly toward the mud pit, ignoring Nathan's threatening presence and focusing entirely on Duke's condition. "Mom, is he going to make it?" Tyler's voice cracked with barely controlled anguish. "Tyler, how did you know to come here?" Margaret asked, even as she maintained her protective position beside Duke. "I've been tracking this story for weeks," Tyler replied, his hands shaking as he knelt beside the trapped dog. "Charles Weatherby's death, the missing inheritance, Duke's disappearance, it's all connected. But I never thought I'd find him like this." The federal agent introduced himself as Detective Rodriguez from the Denver Financial Crimes Unit. "Mr. Johnson contacted our office 3 days ago with evidence of insurance fraud and potential homicide related to Charles Weatherby's death. We've been building a case against Nathan Cross for weeks." Nathan's world was collapsing in real time, his carefully constructed plans unraveling with each revelation. The business associates were already retreating toward their vehicles, recognizing that loyalty had its limits when federal charges were involved. "This is all circumstantial," Nathan protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't prove I did anything illegal." Tyler pulled out his phone, scrolling through saved files with practiced efficiency. "Actually, we can. Charles Weatherby's neighbor had security cameras that captured you visiting his house the night before his accident. The same cameras show you loading Duke into a van 3 days later." Duke's response to Tyler's presence was immediate and profound. Despite his critical condition, the German shepherd attempted to lift his head, whimpering with recognition and what could only be described as joy. The connection between dog and young man was unmistakable. They knew each other, and their history ran deep. "Tyler," Margaret whispered, pieces of a larger puzzle suddenly clicking into place. "You know Duke, don't you?" Her son's tears began falling freely, years of suppressed emotion breaking through his carefully maintained public persona. "Mom, this is the dog I told you about, the one from the lake 5 years ago, when I was stupid enough to go swimming alone after drinking. Duke dove in and pulled me to shore when I went under. I never told you the whole truth because I was ashamed of needing rescue." The revelation staggered Margaret. Her son had nearly died, been saved by this noble animal, and carried that secret alone for 5 years. Duke's presence here, his recognition of Margaret's voice, the inheritance documents, suddenly everything made perfect sense. "Charles Weatherby trained Duke at that lake," Detective Rodriguez added. "It was part of an extensive therapy dog program for people dealing with trauma and addiction. Your son was one of Duke's success stories, though he probably doesn't realize how many others this dog has saved over the years." Nathan's desperation reached its breaking point as he realized the full scope of his exposure. Not only had he committed multiple felonies, but he'd done so against a dog beloved by thousands of people who'd benefited from Duke's service. The public relations disaster would be absolute. "You don't understand," Nathan pleaded, his voice taking on a pathetic quality. "I didn't have a choice. The debts, the threats, they were going to kill me if I didn't deliver that inheritance money. Duke was dying anyway from the brain tumor. I thought if he died here, naturally the money would revert to me as backup beneficiary." "Brain tumor?" Becky looked up sharply from her medical work. "I've seen his recent scans. There's no tumor. Whoever told you that was lying." The final piece of Nathan's delusion crumbled. Someone had manipulated him just as thoroughly as he'd tried to manipulate Duke's fate. The web of deceit ran deeper than anyone had imagined, with multiple victims caught in its threads. As sheriff's deputies moved to arrest Nathan and his fleeing associates, Margaret focused on what mattered most: Duke's survival. The brave German shepherd who'd saved her son, who'd comforted countless trauma victims, who'd been betrayed by human greed but never lost his capacity for trust. "Let's get him to the clinic," Becky urged. "We've got maybe 90 minutes before it's too late." Tyler's cameras captured every moment as his YouTube audience watched a real-life rescue unfold, not a treasure hunt for gold or artifacts, but the infinitely more valuable discovery of family, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and the animals who choose to love them unconditionally. The battle for Duke's life was far from over, but for the first time since arriving at the mud pit, Margaret felt genuine hope that they might all survive this desert ordeal together. The race against time began as soon as Duke was freed from his mud prison. Becky's mobile veterinary unit transformed into an emergency surgery suite while Tyler's cameras rolled, capturing every desperate moment for his 3 million subscribers who were now witnessing something far more profound than his usual treasure-hunting adventures. Margaret rode in the back of the unit, her weathered hands never leaving Duke's trembling form as his vital signs fluctuated wildly on the monitoring equipment. "His blood pressure is crashing," Becky called out over the engine noise, her hands working with surgical precision to insert additional IV lines. "The prolonged exposure has triggered systemic organ failure. Even if we stabilize him, the damage might be irreversible." Duke's eyes, though clouded with pain and exhaustion, remained fixed on Margaret's face with unwavering trust. The German shepherd's breathing had become increasingly labored, each inhalation a monumental effort that spoke to his extraordinary will to survive. Margaret found herself whispering prayers she hadn't uttered since Harold's final days, her nurse's training warring with a grandmother's desperate hope. Tyler followed in his rental car, live-streaming the journey to his audience while maintaining a steady commentary that revealed depths of emotion his viewers had never witnessed. "This isn't just any dog," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Duke saved my life 5 years ago, and I never had the courage to tell my mother. Now I might lose him before I can make that right." The comments flooding Tyler's stream reflected the global audience's investment in Duke's survival. Thousands of viewers from around the world were following the rescue in real time, many sharing their own stories of dogs who had touched their lives. The hashtag #SaveDuke began trending within minutes, transforming a local rescue into an international moment of shared humanity. Jim Mitchell coordinated with law enforcement from his truck, his firefighter's instincts managing logistics and communications, while the medical team focused on Duke's care. The arrest of Nathan Cross had revealed connections to a larger criminal organization involved in estate fraud and animal trafficking, but those revelations would have to wait. Right now, only Duke's immediate survival mattered. As they reached Becky's clinic, a crowd had already gathered. Word of the rescue had spread through the tight-knit rural community with remarkable speed, and neighbors who rarely spoke to each other found themselves united in concern for a dog they'd never met, but somehow felt connected to through Margaret's ordeal. The surgical suite at Becky's converted barn clinic had never hosted such a critical case. Designed primarily for routine veterinary procedures and emergency farm animal care, it now became the stage for a life-or-death battle that would test every skill Becky had acquired in 23 years of practice. "I need everyone out except essential personnel," Becky announced as she prepped for surgery. "Margaret, I know you want to stay, but I need space to work." "I'm not leaving him," Margaret replied with quiet firmness. "I'm a registered nurse with 45 years of experience. Let me help." The surgery began at 11:47 p.m. with Margaret assisting despite her arthritis-stiffened fingers, and Tyler documenting from outside the sterile field. Duke's condition continued deteriorating as Becky worked to repair internal damage caused by prolonged exposure and dehydration. The German Shepherd's heart rate spiked dangerously during the initial examination, revealing the extent of stress his body had endured. "There's more damage than I initially assessed," Becky reported grimly. "His kidneys are barely functioning, and there's evidence of deliberate poisoning, some kind of anti-freeze compound that Nathan must have given him before the abandonment." The revelation sent Tyler into a rage that his viewers witnessed in real time. That bastard didn't just abandon Duke, he tried to poison him first. He wanted to make sure Duke died slowly and painfully. Margaret's hands trembled with fury, but she channeled that anger into focused assistance as Becky worked to flush toxins from Duke's system. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of feeling useless and forgotten, she was once again fighting to save a life, using skills she'd thought were no longer needed. Outside the clinic, the gathered crowd had grown to include people from 3 counties. Jim Mitchell coordinated with local churches to provide coffee and food for the vigil that was spontaneously forming. Elderly ranchers stood beside young families, all united in hope for a dog they'd adopted as their own through Margaret's courage. At 12:43 a.m., Duke's heart stopped. The monitors screamed their electronic warnings as Becky immediately began CPR compressions on the German Shepherd's chest. Margaret assisted with rescue breathing while Tyler's stream captured the desperate battle for life unfolding in the small-town veterinary clinic. "Come on, Duke," Margaret whispered between breaths. "You've saved so many people. Let us save you." The resuscitation efforts continued for 8 agonizing minutes before Duke's heartbeat returned, weak but steady. The watching audience, now numbering over 100,000 viewers, erupted in digital celebration as the monitors showed renewed signs of life, but their relief was short-lived. Duke's neurological responses remained minimal, and his breathing required mechanical assistance. Becky's examination revealed the devastating truth. Prolonged oxygen deprivation might have caused irreversible brain damage. "I need to be honest with you," Becky told Margaret and Tyler as they stood beside Duke's still form. "Even if he survives, he might not be the same dog. The neurological damage could be extensive." Margaret looked down at Duke's peaceful face, remembering the intelligent eyes that had tracked her every movement in the desert mud pit. The thought of this noble animal existing without the consciousness and awareness that made him special was almost unbearable. Tyler's stream had become a global prayer circle, with viewers sharing stories of their own beloved animals and offering support for Duke's recovery. Comments poured in from veterinarians around the world, offering advice and encouragement. The rescue had transcended entertainment, becoming a shared human experience that reminded people of their capacity for compassion. At 2:15 a.m., Duke opened his eyes. The moment was captured on Tyler's camera as the German Shepherd's gaze found Margaret's face and his tail managed a single, weak wag. His neurological responses appeared intact. He recognized voices, responded to gentle touch, and showed awareness of his surroundings. "It's a miracle," Becky whispered, her professional composure finally cracking as tears ran down her cheeks. "I've never seen recovery this dramatic after such extensive trauma." Margaret leaned down to Duke's ear, her voice carrying the warmth of a lifetime spent nurturing others back to health. "Welcome back, beautiful boy. You scared us, but you're safe now. You're going to be just fine." Duke's response was immediate and profound. He tried to lift his head to lick Margaret's face, his tail wagging with increasing strength despite the medications and medical equipment surrounding him. The connection between them had survived his brush with death, if anything growing stronger through their shared ordeal. The crowd outside the clinic erupted in cheers as word spread of Duke's recovery. Car horns honked, church bells rang in nearby towns, and Tyler's live stream exploded with celebration from viewers who had invested their hearts in a dog they'd never met, but would never forget. As dawn approached, bringing the promise of a new day, Margaret realized that saving Duke had accomplished something she'd thought impossible. It had brought her son home, restored her sense of purpose, and reminded an entire community of their shared capacity for kindness. Duke would need weeks of recovery and rehabilitation, but his survival was no longer in question. The German Shepherd, who had spent his life saving others, had been saved in return. Through the determination of three strangers who refused to let cruelty triumph over compassion. The battle was won, but Margaret sensed that their story was far from over. Duke's rescue had set forces in motion that would reshape all their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. 3 days after Duke's miraculous recovery, Margaret's world collapsed in ways she never anticipated. The German Shepherd was making remarkable progress, walking short distances with assistance and showing flashes of his former intelligence. But the legal complications surrounding his rescue had exploded into a nightmare that threatened to destroy everything she'd fought to save. The inheritance documents that had seemed like a blessing now felt like a curse. Charles Weatherby's estate was frozen pending a federal investigation into his death, and multiple parties had emerged claiming rights to Duke and the $2.3 million inheritance. Nathan Cross, despite his arrest, had filed an injunction from jail claiming ownership of Duke based on forged adoption papers that predated Charles Weatherby's will. Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at a stack of legal notices that represented more money in attorney fees than she'd seen in her lifetime. The ranch foreclosure was proceeding as scheduled, and her meager savings had been depleted by Duke's emergency medical care. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She'd saved a dog worth millions while losing her own home in the process. "Mom, you have to let me help with the legal fees," Tyler pleaded over breakfast, his usual confidence replaced by helpless frustration. "My YouTube channel is pulling in serious money now. The Duke rescue videos have gone viral beyond anything I've ever done." Margaret's pride rebelled against accepting charity, even from her own son. "I won't be a burden to you, Tyler. I made my choice when I stopped for Duke, and I'll live with the consequences." But the consequences were multiplying faster than any of them could handle. Duke's story had attracted international attention, bringing both support and unwanted scrutiny. Animal rights activists camped outside Becky's clinic demanding Duke's immediate placement in a sanctuary. Reporters hounded Margaret for exclusive interviews about the miracle dog of Wyoming, turning her quiet life into a media circus. The worst blow came when Tyler received a phone call that drained the color from his face. "Mom, sit down," he said, his voice hollow with shock. "That was Detective Rodriguez. They've discovered something about Charles Weatherby's will that changes everything." Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup, preparing for another devastating revelation. "What now?" "Charles Weatherby wasn't your brother Charlie," Tyler said quietly. "The DNA tests came back negative. He was a con artist who'd been researching our family history for months, looking for the perfect mark. The inheritance is real, but it was stolen from the actual Charles Weatherby's estate in Colorado. We've been part of an elaborate fraud from the beginning." The truth hit Margaret like a physical blow. The brother she'd mourned, the family connection she'd felt to Duke, the sense of destiny that had driven her to risk everything, all of it had been an illusion. She'd been manipulated by a dead criminal who had used her compassion as a weapon against her own interests. Duke, recovering in his makeshift bed beside the kitchen table, sensed Margaret's distress and struggled to his feet. Despite his weakness, the German Shepherd managed to place his massive head in her lap, offering the only comfort he could provide. His dark eyes held no knowledge of legal complications or stolen inheritances, only the pure, uncomplicated love that had motivated Margaret's rescue in the first place. "It doesn't matter," Margaret said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. Duke is real. His suffering was real. The choice to save him was right regardless of who his owner was or what documents he carried. Tyler's YouTube audience, now numbering over 5 million subscribers, had become emotionally invested in Duke's story and Margaret's plight. The comments sections overflowed with offers of financial support, legal assistance, and homes for Duke if Margaret couldn't keep him. But the legal system moved with glacial slowness, and each day brought new complications. The breaking point came when Margaret received an eviction notice for the ranch, effective in 72 hours. The bank had lost patience with legal delays and was proceeding with foreclosure regardless of pending inheritance claims. Margaret would lose the home where she'd spent her entire married life, and Duke would need to be surrendered to animal control pending resolution of the ownership dispute. Becky Foster brought the final devastating news personally, her face drawn with exhaustion from fighting both Duke's medical needs and the bureaucratic maze surrounding his care. "Margaret, I'm so sorry, but animal control is demanding Duke's surrender tomorrow. They're citing public safety concerns and the ongoing legal dispute. If you don't comply, they'll obtain a court order." Margaret looked at Duke, who had just begun showing glimpses of his former personality. The gentle intelligence, the therapeutic instincts, the remarkable capacity for forgiveness despite everything he'd endured. The thought of surrendering him to a government facility where he'd be just another case number rather than the extraordinary individual he was felt like betrayal. "Over my dead body," Margaret said with quiet finality. "I didn't save Duke from one form of imprisonment just to deliver him to another." That evening, as Margaret sat on her porch watching Duke take his first unassisted walk around the yard, Jim Mitchell approached with the expression she'd learned to recognize as harboring bad news. His usual stoic demeanor had cracked, revealing the emotional investment he'd developed in Duke's recovery. "Maggie, I need to tell you something about Tyler," Jim said heavily. "Something he asked me to keep secret, but you deserve to know." Margaret's heart clenched with dread. After everything they'd been through, she couldn't handle another family secret or betrayal. "Tyler's been getting death threats," Jim continued. "People connected to Nathan Cross's criminal organization. They blame him for exposing their operation, and they're using his public profile to track his movements. He's been staying in hotels under assumed names, afraid to come home because it might put you and Duke in danger." The revelation explained Tyler's recent nervousness, his insistence on handling legal matters remotely, his suggestion that Margaret consider relocating temporarily. Her son was sacrificing his own safety and career to protect a mother who had spent months believing he didn't care about her welfare. As if summoned by their conversation, Tyler's rental car appeared in the driveway, arriving under cover of darkness for what might be their last night together in the family home. Margaret watched her son emerge from the vehicle with the cautious movements of someone expecting threats from every shadow. Duke's reaction to Tyler's arrival was immediate and joyful. The German shepherd's tail wagged with strength that belied his recent trauma, and he managed a few excited barks that echoed across the quiet ranch. For a moment, watching her son kneel to embrace the dog they'd saved together, Margaret felt a flicker of the happiness that had seemed permanently lost. But tomorrow would bring eviction, Duke's surrender, and the final dissolution of everything she'd fought to preserve. The rescue that had seemed like a miracle was becoming a tragedy that would destroy 3 lives instead of saving 1. Margaret had faced many defeats in her 72 years, but none had felt as crushing as this moment when victory and loss seemed inextricably intertwined. The truth that would change everything arrived at 3:47 a.m. in the form of an emergency phone call from Detective Rodriguez. Margaret answered on the second ring, her nurse's instincts alert despite exhaustion, while Duke raised his head from his bed beside her kitchen table, sensing the tension in the pre-dawn darkness. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to sit down," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying an urgency that made Margaret's heart race. We've uncovered something about Duke that changes everything we thought we knew about this case. Tyler appeared in the kitchen doorway, awakened by the phone's ring and his mother's sharp intake of breath. He moved closer as Margaret put the call on speaker, Duke struggling to his feet with obvious concern for the humans who had saved his life. "The real Charles Weatherby isn't dead," Rodriguez continued, his words hitting the quiet kitchen like thunderbolts. "He's been in a medically induced coma for 3 months following a deliberate poisoning attempt. He woke up yesterday and immediately asked about Duke. Mrs. Thompson, the man who died in that car accident, was an imposter, a con artist named Robert Kellerman who had assumed Charles's identity to access his fortune." Margaret's mind reeled as the implications crashed over her. But the DNA tests were run against samples from Kellerman, not the real Charles Weatherby. "We've confirmed through dental records and hospital documentation that Charles is alive and has been fighting for his life in a Denver ICU while his identity was stolen and his beloved dog was used as bait in an elaborate fraud scheme." Duke's tail began wagging with increasing intensity, as if the German shepherd somehow sensed that his true family was still alive. His dark eyes remained fixed on Margaret's face, but there was something in his expression, a hopeful alertness that hadn't been there since his rescue from the desert mud. Tyler grabbed his laptop and began frantically searching for information about Charles Weatherby, his YouTube instincts demanding visual confirmation of this stunning revelation. Within minutes, he'd pulled up recent hospital records and news articles about a prominent Denver philanthropist who had been in intensive care following a mysterious illness that doctors now recognized as deliberate poisoning. "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "Charles Weatherby is your brother, Charlie Thompson. The real DNA tests confirm it. He's been looking for you for 30 years, ever since he recovered from the addiction issues that drove your family apart. He changed his name legally to distance himself from his past, but he never stopped hoping to reconcile with his sister Margaret." The revelation shattered Margaret's composure completely. Her brother Charlie, lost to pride and addiction 3 decades ago, was alive, had been searching for her, and had trained Duke as a therapy dog while building a fortune he'd intended to share with his only surviving family. The brother she'd mourned was fighting for his life in a Denver hospital while criminals used his identity to orchestrate an elaborate con game. "Duke knows, doesn't he?" Margaret whispered, looking down at the German shepherd whose entire body was vibrating with excitement. "He's been trying to get home to Charlie all along." "Charles trained Duke specifically to find and assist family members in crisis," Rodriguez explained. "The dog's GPS collar was programmed with your ranch's coordinates." When Kellerman's accomplices abandoned Duke in the desert, he was actually trying to reach you. Charles had shown him your photograph and taught him to recognize your scent. Duke's been following his training perfectly, even while dying. Tyler's camera was rolling now, capturing his mother's tears and Duke's increasingly animated behavior as the truth emerged. The German shepherd seemed to understand that his beloved master was alive, his recovery accelerating with each passing minute as hope replaced the depression that had shadowed his medical treatment. "But Nathan Cross, how does he fit into this?" Tyler asked, his investigative instincts still functioning despite the emotional overload. Cross was Kellerman's inside man at the hospital where Charles was being treated. He had access to Charles's personal effects, including information about Duke and the family inheritance. When Charles lapsed into the coma, Cross and Kellerman saw an opportunity to steal his entire identity and fortune. The second major revelation came with Detective Rodriguez's next words. "Mrs. Thompson, Charles has been conscious and lucid for 18 hours now. He's been asking specifically about Duke and about finding his sister Margaret. When we told him about the rescue, he broke down crying. He wants to see both of you immediately." Duke's response was immediate and profound. The German shepherd began pacing excitedly despite his recent surgery, whimpering with an urgency that spoke of deep emotional connection. His recovery, which had been progressing slowly, suddenly accelerated as if the prospect of reuniting with his true family was providing healing that no medicine could match. "There's one more thing," Rodriguez added, his voice softening. "Charles wants you to know that Duke wasn't just trained as a therapy dog. He was trained specifically to find you if Charles ever became incapacitated. Every exercise, every scenario was designed to prepare Duke to locate Margaret Thompson and bring her back to Charles. The inheritance documents Duke carried weren't just legal papers, they were a love letter from a brother who never stopped believing in family." Margaret sank into her kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Charlie's planning and the depth of love represented by Duke's training. Her brother had spent years preparing for a reunion, while she'd spent the same years believing he was lost forever. Duke had been the bridge between them, carrying Charlie's hope across time and distance until the moment when Margaret's compassion made their reunion possible. Tyler was documenting every moment of this revelation for his audience, but his usual showmanship had been replaced by genuine emotion as he witnessed his mother's transformation from despair to overwhelming joy. "Mom, we need to get to Denver immediately. Charlie's been waiting 30 years to see you." But the most stunning revelation was yet to come. Duke suddenly moved with purpose toward the kitchen window, standing on his hind legs to look out at the driveway despite his recent surgery. His behavior was so specific and urgent that Margaret joined him at the window, peering out into the pre-dawn darkness. Headlights were approaching up the ranch road, not the aggressive formation that had announced Nathan Cross's arrival, but a single vehicle moving slowly and carefully. As it drew closer, Margaret could see it was a medical transport van with Denver hospital markings. "Mrs. Thompson," Rodriguez said quietly. "Charles insisted on making the trip despite his condition. He's been in that van for 4 hours, refusing to wait another day to meet the sister who saved his dog's life." Duke's GPS collar sent a signal when his vitals improved. Charles knew his dog was safe and insisted on coming to thank you personally. The van stopped in Margaret's driveway, and Duke's excitement became almost uncontainable. The German Shepherd was whimpering and scratching at the door with desperate urgency, his tail wagging so violently his entire body shook. 30 years of separation, months of deliberate cruelty, and weeks of recovery were about to culminate in a reunion that would heal wounds spanning decades. Tyler opened the kitchen door, and Duke bounded out with strength that defied his recent trauma, racing toward the medical van with joyful barks that echoed across the Wyoming ranch. Margaret followed more slowly, her heart pounding with emotions she couldn't begin to process. The van's side door opened, and a man emerged who was unmistakably her brother Charlie, older, grayer, bearing the marks of recent illness, but alive and smiling through tears that matched her own. Duke reached him first, rearing up to place his paws on Charlie's shoulders in a reunion that spoke of unbreakable bonds between human and animal. "Hello, Maggie," Charlie said softly, his voice carrying the warmth she remembered from their childhood. "I've been looking for you for a very long time. Thank you for saving our boy." The moment when Margaret embraced the brother she'd thought she'd lost forever, with Duke dancing around them in ecstatic celebration and Tyler capturing the reunion that would touch millions of hearts, marked the transformation of tragedy into triumph. But even as Margaret held Charlie tight, she sensed that their story was entering its final, most important chapter, one that would determine not just Duke's future, but the legacy of love that had brought them all together against impossible odds. 6 months after the desert rescue that had changed everything, Margaret stood on the front porch of the newly christened Duke's Haven Ranch, watching her granddaughter Emma teach Duke how to retrieve tennis balls with the gentle patience that seemed to run in their family. The German Shepherd, now fully recovered and sporting a glossy coat that spoke of excellent health, moved with the dignified grace of a dog who had survived the unthinkable and emerged stronger. The transformation of Margaret's life had been nothing short of miraculous. Charlie's inheritance, the legitimate fortune he'd built through decades of successful real estate investments, had not only saved the ranch from foreclosure, but funded its conversion into a therapy animal sanctuary that served veterans, trauma survivors, and families throughout the Mountain West region. The brother and sister team that had been separated for 30 years now worked together daily, their shared mission of healing creating the family bond they'd lost to pride and misunderstanding. Tyler's documentation of Duke's rescue and recovery had evolved far beyond viral YouTube content. The series had been optioned by a major streaming service, with the proceeds funding a foundation that provided emergency veterinary care for abandoned animals. More importantly for Margaret, Tyler had moved back to Wyoming permanently, bringing his wife Sarah and 4-year-old Emma to live in the ranch's renovated guest house. "Grandma Maggie, watch this," Emma called out, her voice carrying the pure joy that seemed to follow Duke wherever he went. The little girl had formed an instant bond with the therapy dog, and Duke's gentle nature with children had become legendary throughout the community. Duke dropped the tennis ball at Emma's feet and sat with perfect posture, his tail wagging as he waited for the next throw. His recovery had exceeded every medical prediction. Not only had he regained full physical function, but his therapeutic instincts had sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. Veterans who had struggled with PTSD for decades found peace in Duke's presence, and children who had been afraid of dogs learned to trust through his patient guidance. Jim Mitchell emerged from the ranch's new workshop, where he'd been building specialized equipment for disabled animals. His friendship with Margaret had deepened into something neither of them had expected to find at their age. Not romance exactly, but a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. His expertise in emergency response had proved invaluable in establishing the ranch's rescue protocols. "Charlie's on his way back from Denver," Jim reported, wiping sawdust from his hands. "The doctors gave him a clean bill of health. All traces of the poisoning are gone, and his heart function is back to normal." Margaret smiled, still marveling at her brother's resilience. Charlie had not only survived the deliberate poisoning that had nearly killed him, but emerged from the ordeal with renewed purpose. His near-death experience had crystallized his priorities, and he'd thrown himself into the ranch project with an energy that belied his 74 years. Dr. Rebecca Foster's veterinary clinic had expanded into a full-service animal hospital thanks to funding from Charlie's foundation. She split her time between treating ranch animals and training the next generation of veterinary professionals in trauma care for abandoned and abused animals. Her partnership with the ranch had saved countless animal lives and provided her with the financial stability to continue serving rural communities. The legal aftermath of Duke's case had provided closure for everyone involved. Nathan Cross had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for fraud, attempted murder, and animal cruelty. The criminal organization that had targeted Charlie's fortune had been dismantled, with 17 arrests and millions of dollars recovered. More satisfying to Margaret was the fact that several other animals had been rescued from similar abandonment schemes, their lives saved because Duke's story had exposed the criminals' methods. Tyler jogged up from the lower pasture where he'd been filming a segment about the ranch's newest residents, 3 rescued Mustangs that were being trained as therapy horses. His YouTube channel had evolved into a platform for animal rescue stories, environmental conservation, and family healing. The millions of subscribers who had followed Duke's rescue now supported dozens of similar efforts across the country. "Mom, you need to see the latest numbers," Tyler said, slightly out of breath but grinning with excitement. "The Duke Foundation has just surpassed $2 million in donations. We can expand the Veterans Program and add the Children's Trauma Therapy Wing we've been planning." Margaret felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with humility. The ranch that had once represented her last desperate attempt to maintain independence had become a beacon of hope for people and animals throughout the region. Letters arrived daily from families whose lives had been touched by the programs Charlie and Margaret had created together. Duke trotted over to Margaret, carrying his tennis ball as an offering. At 9.5 years old, he moved with the confidence of a dog who knew he was beloved and secure. The scars from his desert ordeal had faded, both physical and emotional, replaced by the serene contentment that came from fulfilling his purpose as a healer and companion. "What do you think, Duke?" Margaret asked, scratching behind his ears in the spot that never failed to make his tail wag. "Ready for another adventure?" Duke's response was immediate. He dropped the ball and assumed his working position, alert and ready for whatever task awaited him. His training as a therapy dog had been supplemented by new skills learned at the ranch, including search and rescue techniques that had already proved valuable in locating lost hikers and missing children. Charlie's truck appeared on the horizon, raising a familiar cloud of dust as it approached the ranch house. Duke's ears perked up with recognition, and he bounded toward the driveway with the enthusiasm he reserved for family arrivals. The bond between Charlie and Duke had only strengthened during their shared recovery, each drawing strength from the other's presence. Margaret walked toward the truck, accompanied by the extended family that had formed around Duke's rescue. Tyler carried Emma on his shoulders while Sarah documented the reunion with the camera skills she'd learned from her husband. Jim fell into step beside Margaret, and Becky emerged from the clinic building where she'd been treating a rescued owl. Charlie climbed down from his truck with the careful movements of a man who had learned not to take physical strength for granted, but his smile was radiant as Duke greeted him with joyful barks and enthusiastic tail wagging. The German shepherd's happiness at these daily reunions never diminished, as if he understood how precious every moment with his beloved humans had become. "How did the donor meeting go?" Margaret asked, embracing her brother with the easy affection that had replaced 30 years of regret and separation. "Better than we hoped," Charlie replied, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction that came from meaningful work. The Morrison Foundation wants to fund similar programs in 5 other states. Duke's story has inspired a national movement. Emma squirmed down from Tyler's shoulders and ran to Charlie, who swept her up in his arms with the delight of a grandfather who was making up for lost time. Duke circled them with protective attention, his therapeutic instincts ensuring that every family member felt included in the welcome. As the sun set over the Wyoming mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the extended family gathered on the ranch house porch for their daily tradition of sharing stories and planning for tomorrow's activities. Duke positioned himself in the center of the group, his presence a constant reminder of the love and determination that had brought them all together. Margaret looked around at the faces illuminated by the warm porch light. Her brother Charlie, healthy and purposeful. Her son Tyler, finally understanding that true treasure couldn't be measured in gold. Her granddaughter Emma, growing up surrounded by the values of compassion and service. Her friends Jim and Becky, who had become chosen family. And Duke, the remarkable German shepherd whose courage and resilience had taught them all about the power of unconditional love. The ranch's guest register showed bookings for the next 18 months, with families traveling from across the country to experience the healing programs that Duke had inspired. The waiting list for the Veterans Retreat included names from every branch of military service, men and women seeking the peace that Duke's presence seemed to provide. "You know what I've learned from all this?" Margaret said quietly, her hand resting on Duke's head as he dozed contentedly beside her chair. "Sometimes the family you choose becomes more important than the one you were born into, and sometimes a dying dog in the desert can teach you more about living than 70 years of human experience." Duke opened one eye to look at Margaret, his tail thumping softly against the porch boards in agreement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals to rescue, new people to heal, but tonight they were all exactly where they belonged, together, grateful and blessed by the love that multiplies when freely given. The stars emerged over Duke's Haven Ranch, and Margaret Thompson smiled with the deep satisfaction of a life redeemed through courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that every creature deserves a chance to be saved. At 72, Margaret Thompson thought her life's greatest chapters were behind her, widowed, facing foreclosure, estranged from her son, surviving on $247, and fading memories. Then she found Duke, a dying German shepherd trapped in desert mud, and everything changed. What started as a simple act of compassion became a journey that reunited her with a brother she'd mourned for 30 years, healed her fractured relationship with her son, and transformed her ranch into a sanctuary that touches thousands of lives. Duke's rescue taught Margaret that it's never too late for new beginnings, that family can be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes saving someone else is how we save ourselves. The empty dinner table where she once set 2 plates became a gathering place for multiple generations. Her greatest regret, feeling useless after Harold's death, transformed into her greatest purpose as she discovered that accumulated wisdom and experience aren't endpoints, but tools for building something beautiful. Margaret learned that the golden years aren't about winding down, but about stepping up when it matters most. Share your thoughts. Have you ever found unexpected purpose in helping someone else? What rescue moment changed your perspective on what's still possible in your life? Leave a comment below. Your story might inspire someone who needs to hear it today.